Welcome everybody. This is our fourth session for the 2021 Politics and Action series being hosted by the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney. Before we get started today, I would like to begin today's proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm dialing in from today and the land which hosts the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre at the University of Sydney. That's the Gadigal land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation are the hosts of that land. I'd like to pay my respects to them, their elders past, present and emerging, who will continue to act as custodians for this land and continue the long tradition of education that has been ongoing on this land for many millennia. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today for the Myanmar update. There's so much happening in Myanmar at the moment. I'm sure that there are a lot of you who are interested to hear what Professor Melissa Crouch has to say about the current events there. Melissa is Professor and Associate Dean of Research at the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney. She leads the Southeast Asia Law and Policy Forum, and Melissa's research focuses on comparative constitutional law, law and society, and law and religion in Southeast Asia. And she has been following the situation in Myanmar very closely over the last couple of years. With that, actually, before Melissa starts, just to let you know, we do have a Q&A function down the bottom of the screen where you can submit questions to Melissa. There will be only a limited amount of time for questions at the end. So if you have something that you're really keen to ask, I suggest that you get that question in there as soon as possible. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Melissa now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Liz, and to others at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for the opportunity to be part of this year's Politics in Action in Southeast Asia. Today, in talking about Myanmar, I want to talk about before and after the 1st of February. As many of you will be aware, on the 1st of February, the military staged a coup in Myanmar. To give you a sense of the changes that are happening and the reversals of many of the reforms that are taking place. Today, the military transferred the General Administration Department back to the Ministry of Home Affairs. Why is that important? Well, in Myanmar, the Minister for Home Affairs is appointed by the military. It's sort of traditionally been a ministry that the military has had control and influence over. The General Administration Department is like the backbone of the administration of the government across the country. And so in many ways, this announcement today was a sign that the military was taking back control of that administration and was reversing some of the reforms that the former National League for Democracy government had attempted, which was really an attempt to try and demilitarize or civilianize the civil service in Myanmar. So we're certainly going backwards. But what are we to make of politics in action in Myanmar? My basic argument today is that it's not so much about politics in action, but military oppression of politics. The picture I'd like to start with is of the November 2020 elections. So before 1st of February, let me give a brief recap of the past 10 years, if you like. We had from 10 years of relative political reforms. Of course, the first 5 years were under a military-led USDP government up until 2016. We then had the first term of a National League for Democracy government, so the last 5 years from 2016 to 2020. Over those 10 years, Myanmar has engaged much more with the region and with the international community. There have been new opportunities and freedoms, relative opening of the media sector, although of course always still some compromises and challenges, relatively new economic opportunities, and yet of course COVID was the first thing to really challenge a lot of that. So prior to the November 2020 elections, COVID had a significant effect on the social and economic fabric of Myanmar. Of course, a lot of the tourism industry was lost, the further potential for foreign investment, but also a significant economic crisis because of the decline in tourism and so on. There were lockdowns, but really in many ways 2020 was an incredibly difficult year for people in Myanmar. I think that's important to keep in mind because it's really the context and the backdrop against which the November 2020 elections were held. Now, of course, the NLD won those elections. The military disputed those results. They complained about alleged voter fraud. The military sought various means to complain. It went to the Election Commission, it went to the Parliament, it went to the courts. It wasn't satisfied with any of the responses it got. And of course, there were also further concerns, particularly from some ethnic minority groups or armed ethnic groups in particular, because the NLD had chosen not to hold elections in some areas, particularly some areas where there's active fighting. But there were questions about whether the NLD's decision as to which areas could not have elections, whether that was actually justified or not, or whether it was a way to ensure the NLD would be successful at the elections. Moving on to the after the 1st of February. So what happened on the 1st of February, it was the week in which the incoming government that had been elected in November was supposed to take office. All of the members of parliament were waiting in Naypyidaw, the capital city. And yet on the morning of the 1st of February, early in the morning, the military staged a coup. There was an internet shutdown. There was the arrest of high-level key politicians, including Aung San Suu Kyi. And it followed then several days really of shock, of disbelief that this was happening now, and of relative quiet. Of course, soon after that, the protests started, and the picture you see here is of one of the slogans of defiance, which was that the military has messed with the wrong generation. So a lot of these protests were led by youth. There was a sense of creativity and defiance and hope. We saw the emergence of a number of different organizations, particularly the civil disobedience movement, as well as the emergence of the CRPH, which is the Committee of Representatives for the Pirang Suluto, or the elected representatives who had anticipated taking office in early February. Of course, it wasn't too long after the peaceful protests were met with violence by the military. This violence was arbitrary. It has led to deaths. It has led to thousands of arrests. It has led to credible allegations of torture as well as disappearances. In many ways, it feels like we have been dragged right back to pre-2020. In addition, the ability for people in Myanmar to access the outside world is heavily compromised. Several days after the coup, there were internet shutdowns overnight, and that has continued since. There was then a shutdown of mobile data. There were then increasing difficulties in accessing Wi-Fi, and the picture that you see up here is of an organization, NetBlocks, that tracks this, and the graph shows just how dramatic the changes have been in terms of people's ability to access the internet and therefore the outside world. Despite this, the protests continued. There were many creative ways that this happened. Cars blocked roads. There were silent protests. There were women's movements coming out. There was the use of signs, lots of use of social media, Twitter, Facebook. And of course, there was the CDM movement, which, for a long time effectively closed the banks. They came to a standstill. The railways were closed, the ports were closed, schools were closed. Many civil servants have also participated in this civil disobedience movement by not turning up to work. In addition, we saw the political framework literally go up in flames. While on one hand, the military may still be insisting that its 2008 constitution is still relevant, many of those who oppose the military see the 2008 constitution as now irrelevant. And Again, on Twitter and on Facebook, we saw people burning copies of the 2008 Constitution as a symbolic gesture and as a form of defiance against the role of the military in government, and as a sense that this agreement was now fundamentally broken, even though it was a constitution that was already heavily compromised and greatly contested. So we've seen in particular sort of the formal claims to abolish the constitution by the CRPH, these elected representatives. They have announced a new charter. They have been working towards forming a national unity government, and they're attempting to work towards some sort of interim constitution. We are now at the point where the CRPH is really struggling to gain international recognition, and this is key to determining in many ways what happens next. So why did this happen? There are a number of explanations. I think the internal explanations are perhaps more persuasive, or at least we have more information about some of those than any sort of external pressures. We know that the threat for those who were advocates for democracy and for civilian rule as a bare minimum were always to some extent under threat. We saw very early on in the early years of the National League for Democracy government, the military opposing many of the changes that the NLD attempted. Of course, the military opposed the creation of the position of state councillor, which was the role that Aung San Suu Kyi played for 5 years. And we saw the assassination of a lawyer that was close to the NLD, and that was really taken by the NLD as a sign that the risks were coming close to home. The military was opposing many of the things that it was trying to do, and that assassination really had a chilling effect for many pro-democracy activists. Coming to the end of coming to the end of their term in 2021, I think was a convenient timing too for the military. They knew that all the members of parliament would be in Naypyidaw. They knew where they lived. They knew that it would be easy to arrest some of the key leaders. And I think they found the elections of 2020 in something of a last straw for them. They had tolerated the NLD for 5 years. But we also had the commander-in-chief who was nearing his end of term. So he would have been required to step down from office at the age of 65, which would have been mid-year this year. And we knew that he had ambitions perhaps to be president, but of course now the coup gives him a legitimate or convenient excuse, if you like, to be the ruler of the country. What will happen next? The military says it will rule for at least a year, maybe 2. It claims to be following the constitution, but there are many flaws to that claim. They say they will hold another election and then allow a government to take place under that. The problem with that, of course, is that the NLD is either unlikely to want to run in such a rigged election, or perhaps will simply be prevented from running, given that many key members are under arrest and likely to be so for some time. While in the military imagination, they are still acting under the 2008 constitution, I think for most people, it is very hard to imagine the country going back to that framework in any viable sense. So just to come back now to the core point of my presentation, this idea that the 1st of February is very much a critical juncture in politics in Myanmar. We will be talking for a long time to come about the before and after of this point in time. Before being 10 years of reform, of rapid growth in the use of the internet, of the floating of the Jat, of relative engagement with the outside world. But in many ways, that before that 10 years, it was a transition in the military's own time and in their own way and under their control. This after, in many ways, is a drastic reversal and backwards step from many of those reforms. The coup has stopped everything. This is not like coups in other parts of the region. The country has literally ground to a halt in many respects. Most people are affected. Of course, the poor are hurt the hardest. In many ways, though, no one is immune. The violence and the arrests by the military are often arbitrary, and that is part of their strategy. And so, as I said at the beginning, I think we can, in many ways, we can't really talk about politics in action anymore, but rather about military control and oppression of politics. Thank you, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Melissa. That was a very enlightening and brief update on some very complicated issues that are happening in Myanmar at the moment. We've got a few questions coming through. So I'll start with the first one that I've got here. How are updates from the CRPH being received, and why is their legitimacy being contested by others outside?
Thanks. So the CRPH, this body of people who had been elected in the 2020 elections, or who have been sort of nominated by them, if you like, to be spokespeople for the people of Myanmar, have very quickly formed both an online presence and have been working to try and form, I guess, if you like, diplomatic relations at many levels, in regional and international. I think it's not so much, often, of course, it is governments, including governments like Australia, that will say they deal with states and not governments. And so at the moment, there is still the challenge of trying to persuade countries around the world that they should be dealing with the CRPH rather than with the military. I think this kind of issue, it's obviously been ongoing for a few months now. I think it will perhaps come to a head in the UN in a month or two's time, when really there will be a sense that the UN perhaps has to choose between whether to acknowledge the military ambassador to the UN, or whether they acknowledge the person who was the ambassador but defected, and so is now working in support of the CRPH.
And I have a follow-up question to that here. Why are countries who you might expect to be sympathetic to the CRPH or the NUG dragging their feet over recognizing the legitimacy of the government?
Yeah, so I've heard a number of ideas. I know that there are some who sort of question the role of the state councillor in particular, and perhaps there is some confusion about the status of that role and how it relates to the CRPH. I guess from my perspective, the state councillor role was only ever one created by the NLD. It's not a constitutional position, it was simply one created by the government. While I know that many people saw the state councillor, and perhaps she was treated by her people as the effective de facto leader of the country, if you like, in many ways there was still a president, and actually if you looked at the legal and political system, the president was still the one who was the leader of the country symbolically, if you like, or on paper. So I think in that sense, there's also a challenge around the complexity of the situation in Myanmar. There are many ethnic armed groups, and it has been a real challenge and will be an ongoing challenge for the CRPH to ensure that it is actually genuinely a unity government, to bring on board many of these very diverse groups that have differing levels of, I guess, power. Some have greater access to arms than others. Some are much larger than others. Some, are close to, for example, China. Others are not. And so it is a very complex situation, if you like. And I think there's been questions around, is the CRPH sort of actually representative? But I think what we fall back on is that there was the November 2020 elections. That by and large, these allegations of fraud have been unsubstantiated. There doesn't appear to be any basis to them. And that even if there was some irregularities in the voter list, which is understandable, Myanmar is still in many ways, developing its electoral system, that those irregularities wouldn't have been sufficient to change the outcome of the election in any way. So this idea that if you were to sort of look around for anyone who has any sense of legitimacy to lead the country through a period of transition and going forward, it's those who were elected in the 2020 elections. And given that some of them are under arrest or in prison, those who have been, I guess, appointed in their place, if you like.
It sounds like there are some parallels to other large-scale elections that were held in the previous year there.
Yeah.
I've got the next question here. How do you see the chances of the attempt of the NUG to bring the military to the ICC, presumably the International Criminal Court? Is it mainly an attempt to foster international attention and support, or do you see it as being a separate strategy to actually remove the military from Myanmar politics?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, we have a couple of things going on at the international level, because of also there is the issue with the Rohingya, although that I think it's that's doesn't there's not as much attention to that at the moment. So on the issue of the ICC, I think that the person who asked the question is right in the first emphasis, that I think by and large this is an attempt to keep this at the forefront of international attention, which is hard at the moment given COVID-19 and everything else that is happening around the world. And to try and continue to generate support. I think it would be unlikely to result in the removal of the military from politics. I think the reality is that there is a great reluctance from the international community, or particularly, I guess, we've seen from the Security Council to interfere in any way. It's highly unlikely that we would see any form of sort of direct intervention in Myanmar. And so I think the real challenge going forward is to how to move beyond direct military rule, particularly when many of the civil society movements that are opposing them simply are for understandable reasons not willing to negotiate or engage in any way with the military.
Okay, and changing tack a little bit here, could you say a bit more about the role of social movements and what they've been, the role that they've played since the military seized power in Myanmar?
Yeah, I think social movements have been incredibly important. And obviously this is sort of, probably the first time, I guess, that the online presence, whether it's Twitter and Facebook, have also, played a big role in this. On one hand, some of the strategies are, I guess, common and were ones that we saw post 1988 and into the 1990s. So, lots of young people, lots of civil society groups, lots of different sort of sectors, cross sections of the civil service, whether it's university professors, people in the banking sector, in the railroads, really a very broad cross-section of society showing really strong support and opposition to this military takeover. I think some of the tactics have also been to some extent similar to the late 1980s and early 1990s. Large-scale protests on the street, various forms of creativity with that. And though I think the challenge is that the level of violence, the scale of the brutality, and often its randomness does have a real chilling effect on that. I think civil society movements have been particularly creative in trying to find ways to get around that. So often there are a lot of silent protests online. So people are, leaving signs on roads, they're painting signs on roads and taking aerial photos. I guess they're continually finding ways to remind the international community and, particularly journalists and others who are online day after day after day, that they oppose military rule and that the international community can't forget this and needs to be looking to the long term as to how they're going to work to try to resolve this situation, support people in Myanmar.
Absolutely, it sounds like they've got a very pivotal function or a pivotal role in what's going on at the moment. I want to turn now to a question here about ASEAN and what you make of ASEAN's ability or capacity to de-escalate the situation or facilitate peace in Myanmar? Do you think that they are able to play a role in de-escalating this conflict?
Yeah, there's obviously been a lot of talk about ASEAN and its potential role. Early on, in the sort of first few days and weeks after the 1st of February, I think it was a little uncertain how ASEAN was going to act, although, it obviously sticks with its mantra of non-interference, and we know that, we can't expect radical intervention by ASEAN. Of course, there was some, Indonesia in particular came out and said, we value elections, we stand for democracy in the region, we call for the military to honor the results of that election. And so Indonesia was really kind of drawing on its history and sense in the region of being a democratic country and honoring elections. We saw Singapore come out when the violence got really bad and the military were sort of quite literally shooting people in the head. Singapore, its focus on sort of stability and law and order in the region, came out and condemned the violence, and called for a strong end to it. Obviously, since then, it's become a lot more complicated. We've had this ASEAN meeting in which the military was allowed to attend. And of course, there was a lot of criticism of that, and I think rightly so. There was there's been a number of statements that ASEAN has issued, and one of the most recent ones being as a result of that joint conference. I think since then, if you follow some of the newspapers in Myanmar, it does appear that the military has sort of backtracked from the things that it said at that ASEAN meeting. And so I think at this stage, ASEAN doesn't have a lot of traction. I mean, I do think that ASEAN does have the potential to do more of the behind closed doors, quiet diplomacy response, which I think is one aspect of what is needed, but is certainly only one aspect. And, I don't think we're going to see really strong action taken by ASEAN. I think that would be left to the international community at large.
Thanks for that, Melissa. I was pondering asking you another question, but I don't think that we're going to have time. So with that, I'd like to say a very big thank you for being part of our event this year. I know that you're a big supporter of SEAC, and we always appreciate having you involved in our events. And for all of our viewers, if you would like to watch this again, it is available on the SEAC Facebook page. And for those of you who are heading over to our Philippines update starting in a couple of minutes, I will see you there. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah.